Community Theatre in Middletown. This is Ed Strother talking this evening with Chuck and Dixana Van Camp. The date is August 19th, 1985, and the time of day is now 7:47 in the evening. We're sitting around my dining room table here at 1401 West Ashland, and we've just enjoyed a summer supper of homemade noodles and mashed potatoes and southern cooked green beans and sliced tomatoes, cantaloupe, iced tea, and what have you. We wanted to talk with Chuck and Dixana because they were both very active in Civic Theatre. Chuck was president of Civic Theatre, and Dixana is a long-standing participant in Civic. So let's get started with the conversation of the evening. Chuck and Dixana, I know you both graduated from Central High School, but not both of you were participants in theater at that time. Chuck, you were the one that laid out, right?
That's true. Dixana was the active one.
And what did you do, Dixana?
Well,
Well, it really didn't begin in high school, did it?
no. I started performing really in elementary when we would put on little shows. I was always the one that liked to get up and perform. Mm-hmm. And in junior high, we had a formal production, the 9th grade play, which was a tradition at that time. And then in high school, I enrolled in the junior dramatics class and senior dramatics class, and we put on formal productions there, and then simultaneously I was involved in Civic Theatre and Irene Belcher's Children's Playhouse.
I'd like to take a minute to talk about Irene Belcher's Playhouse. How did Irene organize the Playhouse? What kinds of things did you do day by day or week by week?
She had classes. A part of the time that you spent in the Playhouse were actually instructional classes in some of the basics of theater, of stage presence. Or there wasn't anything as minute as keeping your upstage foot, ahead of the. There wasn't anything quite like that. It was more of an idea of how to project or how to get into a character. More of an instruction type of thing, partly, and then we all participated in productions. And
was it a matter of individual recitation or individual vocal performance?
No, not really. Everything was done in groups, as I recall. There were, she divided us as to experience. I mean, the advanced classes were usually working on a production rather than in very much of a group.
These were afternoon sessions?
Yes, after school. It was up at what is was called the Commercial Club. Well, it's up above what's Jack's Camera Shop now, but it was the old Commercial Club, and we were way up on the 3rd floor.
What time did the class begin and end?
After school, and...
well, does that mean 4 o'clock?
Yes, I think as a rule, between 3:30 and 4 o'clock, and until maybe 7. Something like that.
Long?
I think so. As I recall, we used to be there about 3 hours.
Was that one afternoon a week, 2 afternoons?
No, it usually amounted to at least 2 or 3 afternoons a week. And then sometimes she had a stage up there, and we put on some little productions there. And then we would go to, I think usually Central High School for a major production.
How about Saturdays? Did you work on
Sometimes.
Saturdays?
And then we did go out of town on those. She had a daughter who, I think the daughter taught, or I know the daughter, son-in-law, someone taught, and we would go sometimes to do an evening production at another school out of town, and this was really grown-up stuff.
Oh, be a young
We
girl.
took, I remember The Emperor's New Clothes.
Mm-hmm.
That was one. Fairy tales were stressed quite a bit. That was the type of thing we did.
You speak of your high school days. This was in what decade now?
In the 40s, from 46 to 49. Henrietta Brandt was the dramatics teacher. Eleanor Bly was the speech teacher at Central, but Henrietta Brandt was the one who did the drama.
What was your biggest hit in high school?
Annie Laurie, I guess, because it was a costume show, and we all got to wear costumes instead of modern dress.
Chuck, were you backstage at this time? Or?
No, I was out front. I think that's one of the few high school plays I went to see, mainly because Dixana was in it.
Why weren't you pulled into this?
Well, I was more involved in athletics somewhere along the line, and it just really held no interest for me. But Dixana was thoroughly enthralled with the whole idea of theater.
What was your sport?
I ran track at Central, and I tried to play football, but I wasn't very good at it. But
What event in track?
I ran the high hurdles and high jump and long jump and mile relay.
I wouldn't think you'd be very good at those either.
I wasn't, but I got a lot of seconds and thirds. I never got a first in my life.
Well, I think that's a boy's life, really, to get into sports. I was into football until I got knocked silly, and then I realized I'd better join the debate team and the amateur theatrical club in high school. But the two of you have been friends for a very long time.
Yeah, since high school.
Since high school. And, well, it was good to have you out front. We couldn't get you backstage. But somewhere along the way, you had to get interested in theater because ultimately you're going to end up as president of the board of Muncie Civic Theatre.
Well, there was a 4-year span of time. Dixana was at Northwestern University at that time, and I was with Uncle Sam in Korea with the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And we were married in 52, and Dixie decided that she would spend the last 14 months of my service duty in San Diego, where I finally got stationed. And she decided to quit college, which I think was a mistake at the time. In retrospect, hindsight's great. But she came to California. And while we were at California, in San Diego, where I was stationed, we went to the Old Globe Theater to see a production of Mr. Roberts. And as the name denotes, it was a replica of the Globe Theater in England, and very much so like it, even in the outside appearance and everything. And I guess it was part of an exposition at Balboa Park at one time in San Diego. And I suppose that was probably the time, because it happened to be a service show, and being in the Navy, it might have rung a bell somewhere along the line. But even when we came back to Indiana, moved back to Muncie, after I was discharged, with our first son, was born in California, came with us. And I didn't really have anything to do with theater at that time for quite a while, but Dixana became involved in it again. It was just like she was never away.
Well, when you came back, Dixana, what did you do? How did you get involved?
For a while, we just raised children. And it got to the point where I needed to get away from the house a little bit, and found out that you were directing the Mad Woman Chael, and that was when I came back.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And I said, I would like to do a show again, and there's no one I'd rather do it with than Dr. Strother.
Oh, nice.
So, because I remembered you from high school, because I was in charge of career days for theater at Central High School in 1949, and you came and spoke to us and talked to us about theater. And so, I felt like I sort of knew someone, and I became interested again and went back for Mad Woman, and it was a matter of time before I started dragging him down there, and we got him hooked backstage first. And then eventually there was always a shortage of men, and we finally got him out in front. And you were the one that got him out in front in that Ball State Summer Theater. That was the first thing. In the 10th Theater, that was the first show. He did The Man in the Dog Suit, wasn't it?
Yeah. The day that will live in him.
But he really, I think it was a matter of, if you can't beat him, join him. Because I was involved and I enjoyed it, and he knew that, there must have been something, or I wouldn't keep coming back to it. So.
Well, because of Chuck's skill with tools, he was a very handy man backstage. Mm-hmm. And that reminds me, Chuck, every time I go to Civic Theater, I'm aware of something in that proscenium that very few people are aware of. And that is a little piece of molding in the left of the proscenium arch.
That we replaced.
That you replaced. That you took an impression of that piece of ornamentation, went to your pattern shop, made a mold, and brought the thing back and glued it in. I don't think it's painted quite the same as the neighbors in that proscenium arch. It's
the only way you can pick it out, I think. You can find it.
But I I am one of the few people, I think, that really know about that. Because you didn't boast about it, you just did it and stuck it in there.
I don't think I knew about it. I don't remember.
I did it when
I remember him doing some chairs. There were some broken chairs that had some ornamental kind of carvings, and I remember you did fix some chairs.
first
Well, we
experiment.
must take you to Civic Theater and show you
Oh,
that
you'll have
spot.
to show me that one. I don't know about it.
I remember it's on the left-hand side, about 3 foot up from the stage.
No, Chuck, it's on the right.
All right, that's all right.
I don't know.
That is
the
the,
back.
the actor's right. The actor's
All right, I'll
right.
buy that.
And the audience left. But really, it did fill an ugly little spot that had been there.
Evidently something had backed into it or knocked
Oh,
a
really?
piece of equipment had run into it at one time or another and knocked it off. It was that way when we moved into theater.
Hmm.
There was a lot of the ornamentation that was in bad shape.
Yes.
That they had to do some work on.
Well, your skills in the pattern shop. Tell us a little bit about that. What is a pattern shop, Chuck? I don't
Well, if you say pattern, you're a pattern maker, that really doesn't mean anything to anybody, unless you're affiliated with industry. But a pattern making, basically what I will do is take a blueprint of a part that is to be made into a sand casting, and I'll design and build tooling to make that part.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually the nearest thing you can come to it possibly that people recognize would be tool and die making, where you actually make a mold or an impression to make this part poured in molten metal.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of an intriguing job. I don't think it is a job that will ever drop out completely of industry, although a lot of it has become computerized now. So
nowadays, do you work at all with plastic?
Yes, to some extent we do. As a matter of fact, my first experience with plastic was at the time that I did some work on the chair sticks he was referring to at Civic Theater, where we took some clay impressions off of the existing design and then press molded that impression into plastic to replace it, which seemed to work out fairly well.
Well, this is a really big skill in theater nowadays. You ought to get back into it. How about foam plastic? Do you get into that?
No, but I think there is a gentleman who's an artist, Paul State, Dick Kishel, who does a lot of this sort of thing. He has been in plastic and fiberglass work for a long time, and I'm sure he's familiar with it. We had used some at one time or another. We've got into plastic a little bit, but it didn't really lend itself to some of the operations we had in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Some things work fine, but other applications, the cost is too prohibitive to use.
Well, it was that skill and Dixana's interest that took you into Civic Theater.
I guess, yes.
And you served on the board, and ultimately you became president of the board. And you were president of the board sometime during the 60s.
The year 65 through 66.
65, 66. Now, this is a really big test on the memory, Chuck. What is the most memorable thing of that year? What stands out biggest in your memory when you think of that year?
I'd really have to say some of the technical aspects of Civic Theater improvements that, as you know, I mean, Norman Potts at one time, who you're aware of, directed at Civic Theater and was in Civic Theater plays, did a paper or thesis or whatever, master's paper on Civic Theater and their lighting system. I think he entitled it something like 20 Years of Darkness. But as you well know from experience at Civic Theater, we were very limited on lighting equipment.
Very true.
And at that point in time, about 1963 or 64, I'm not sure just exactly which year, a gentleman named Arthur Wiesen, who kind of got in Civic Theater the same way I did, by chance.
Mm-hmm.
He is an engineer with Westinghouse Corporation, and now at this point in time is in Jackson, Tennessee. Said, can we do something about lights? We know both of us were in the dark, literally in the dark, about theater lights. So we started reading. I think even you gave me a book on stagecraft and lighting, which helped tremendously. I still have that book, and I get out and look at it every once in a while.
I want it back, John.
But it was a very valuable tool, and we decided that hey, with what we've got, there is a lot that isn't being done that can be done with minor modifications. So with that in mind, we went about building light battens, which were almost non-existent in Civic Theater. You fasten them to a drop batten and hope for the best.
Mhm.
And so Art did some designing on that, and he said, well, our thought when we first moved into theater is, boy, wouldn't it be neat if we could get all this lighting equipment from backstage and move it all up in the projection booth. And that was in the back of our mind for about 3 years. And we're going to have to light from the front anyway on musicals with spotlights, so let's move it up in the projection booth. So several of us worked on it, Art included, and there were some other people at the time, I can't remember their names, but they put in a lot of hours too.
Don't I remember Don Austin?
Yes,
Don
Don
Austin's
Austin.
another one, who is also at Westinghouse. Yeah, Don
Mhm.
worked on it, and I think Bill Baker, who
Well,
served
Art
on the
brought
board for a
Don
while.
down, I think.
Art brought Don
Mhm.
down, that's right. And Bill Baker worked on it a little bit, and we would spend Saturdays down there, and it was really kind of enjoyable. It was a hobby getting away from things, and we were doing this, tried to do it in off season when we weren't involved with productions, and we did it practically all in one summer, and got everything moved upstairs and everything set up for the lighting panels. The first show was coming up, and our lighting panel that we had ordered didn't even come in yet. And of course, you know, we were dealing with very limited lighting facilities.
Yes.
And very limited dimmer capacity. And the day of the show, the afternoon of the show, the panel arrived. And Fred Feemeyer and Gomer Nichols and Art Wiesen, and I think Don Austin too, and I wrestled that thing upstairs, because I think it weighed close to 500 pounds.
Had you already pulled cable from
We
the
pulled
stage?
cable,
thing?
yes. We'd had everything up there ready to hook up and anticipating this coming in for dress rehearsals at least. And I had been on the phone. This was prior, I think it's when I was vice president and charge of production, I guess. And we had anticipated the opening show of the season, we'd have the new lighting panel in. We did. The day of performance, it went in. It was untried, untested. We weren't sure of anything. We were operating it while we were still reading the manual.
Do you recall the name of the show?
I can't remember. We were so busy worrying about the lighting panel, but it was a musical. And I'm not too sure that it wasn't the second season. Pajama Game was the first opening musical when we were in the theater.
Yeah.
And I cannot remember.
The second season,
the
it would have been My Fair Lady
No.
or South Pacific.
No, it had to be the first season then. It was the first season.
That had to be
And it was
Pajama Game.
Pajama Game.
Yeah, it must have been. That's right.
Because at that time we were still working on the theater, trying to get everything in shape to get in. It was just everything came together in a collision in about 3 days.
Well, that's the story of theater.
It was mass
That's the
hysteria.
way-
It was mass hysteria, and everybody thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, that's one of the memorable things. And,
It was really. I think that's the one, and that wasn't the year that I was president. That was the first or second year I was involved with.
that was
They're in a
just
new
a
building.
year you were working very hard.
Yeah, and you really didn't have time to single out one thing, because even the year that I was president, there was so much that we were, when I referred to lighting in that year, that was the year that we began purchasing a lot of extra lights that we had sorely needed for years. And people were aware of it, but as you know, in amateur theater, the money is not always available.
That's very true.
And I think that that was a satisfying year. But it was also the year that I decided I was spending more time at the theater than I was spending at home with my family. It was beginning to tell.
Well, I'm sure you remember that too.
You mean the year that you
Here
were
we are. I
president?
was president.
Later.
Yes, there was so much involved, and everybody was working hard. Nobody was goofing off. Everybody had their own area of expertise that they were working in, and everybody had problems. And I think there was a 4 or 5 year span. Also, we were in the process of buying the building, and it was just one thing on top of another, and everything you did created another multitude of problems that you didn't have before. And I got to a point where it almost became insurmountable for me. And a lot of other people who had been around theater much longer than I have were able to sit back and take a little bit more relaxed attitude towards the thing. And I got so caught up in it that I let everything get to me.
Well, while you were president, it was kind of a dual role, though, that you were in, because you were also involved totally in the productions. I mean,
Production,
some
right.
presidents are not involved on both levels, and it just happened that you were president, but you were also producing and building sets, and I think it was just almost a total commitment. I was completely in the background by this time, and he was totally committed.
That's your memorable experience. How far
Well,
in the
we were-
background you were?
We were starting another family too, and so.
She would get me back to normal when I'd get home at night.
No, I loved the idea that he was involved, you know.
But
But it was funny, our roles were reversed at this point.
I would still have to say that my most memorable time and most memorable show at Civic Theater, and I've been to a lot of shows since and before, was South Pacific.
Oh, good.
Which had directed and was very well received by the public, and I think was really totally appreciated. It had shortcomings, all shows do,
Oh, yes.
but I think the good points far outweighed the shortcomings of the show.
Well, we did have a lot of fun, I know.
And everybody had a good time. The cast had a great time. The crew had a real good time. Even the band had fun. And the audience really enjoyed it. And that was the best of all.
Well, now, Chuck has mentioned South Pacific as his memorable experience, Dixana. It's your turn now. Your most memorable experience at Civic Theater.
I think was probably the Diary of Anne Frank, which you also directed, and it was the last show at the Masonic.
See, I'm
really,
getting a lot of exposure.
yeah, I do
here.
know.
I didn't mean
Well,
that
we've
at
all
all.
been kind of connected. That was not at the present theater. I think it was the closing show at Masonic. I think it was the most moving experience I ever had in the theater, and of course the nature of the play itself. And I think as a cast, I can't remember ever being in a show at any time where I think the cast totally submerged themselves in a play. I know I had never felt so completely submerged in a play as the Diary of Anne Frank. I think it was one of the most moving.
Were you Mrs.
Performance.
Frank?
No,
Mrs.
I think
Van
you
Dam?
wanted me to be, but I was Mrs. Van Dam, right.
I think I worked on scenery.
It was just one of those shows that comes along once.
I think I made a big mistake when I directed that.
Oh.
Do you recall the closing moments of the show?
When
And
the
it was a sound
Gestapo
effect,
came?
the sound effect, the tearing down of the door.
Mm-hmm.
And we used the electronic sound.
We had
the
a
can
record.
sound. Yes.
Well,
Right.
the thing that happened, it was probably one of the worst things that could have happened. The first night we did it, the man who was doing the sound had it on the wrong speed. And the Germans were saying, "Ah, rah, rah, rah." And we were on stage, of course, being so emotional, and I was supposed to be crying, and I was actually shaking with laughter because the sound was going on. And
God bless
John
you for
Lowe.
being able to laugh, because I'm sure I was crawling under my chair.
it never happened more than once.
John Lowe
It was,
his art
yes,
was doing the sound.
yes.
And he was sitting
But
back
it got
there
on the wrong
staring
speed.
at that thing. What did I do?
But I thought there never could have been a more dramatic moment. But you know, I don't think, I talked to people in the audience after that.
They
and
didn't notice it.
They really didn't
really
know. They thought, they knew it was German, and they knew it was unintelligible, but they didn't realize that the sound was actually, for a while, on the
This
wrong
was the
speed.
sound of a German door.
They
being
were
broken
pounding on the
in.
door, and they were supposed to be shouting at us, you know. But it was just one of those things that people on stage realized the terrible mistake that was made, and we were helpless.
You know, I still remember some of the dialogue from that because we asked Frank Fellerhoff if he would translate it. And it was something like, Aufmachen da drinnen, come out, hog people, I think was the
That's what
literal
they were shouting
translation, yeah.
on the wrong speed. That's
the
what they
wrong
were.
speed.
That's what they were shouting.
I don't know why that
It was-
stuck with me, but it did, I guess,
Well,
because of that.
At any rate, I think had I to do it over again, I would have made it live rather than canned. And
I see
think
what
it-
you're.
yes,
Yeah.
it would have come off a little better, I think. Yes, I remember that show with affection, and
You used blackouts so effectively in that
Yeah.
show. That was something none of us had done at that point. We didn't use curtains. We used blackout. This was something that at that time kind of new here.
That's
Because
true.
we were used to the traditional theater, the curtain, open and close, open and close. And no one had ever done a show where you walked in the theater and the curtain was already open. That was something to come later yet. But it was different.
Well, I still prefer to work that way. In the next
Without
show I
the curtain?
direct out at the college, I will not use a curtain. I'll just use blackout. And I like it a little better. It flows a little more easily, and it gives people something to look at when they get into the theater and mumble about. When you think of theater right at this particular moment, and when you think of desires for the future and what you would like to see Civic Theater do or hopefully accomplish, is there any particular thing that occurs to you on this August 19th, 1985?
One thing that Civic Theater has never done, that I know of, to my knowledge, that Ed and I drank a few cups of coffee over during working on shows. The possibility of doing a Shakespeare theater, one show, just to try it, to see how it would go. Amateur theater and Shakespeare is a very iffy proposition. But if you're going to deal in Civic Theater, the bigger cities do it. And if you want to upgrade the quality of your theater, I think it ought to be tried sometime. I think the selection of the show would be all important and would have, due to what limitations you have for production facilities and the people you have in mind. A lot of people would say, you hear all the time, well, the show was pre-cast or all that. In some extent, that may be true. But in some shows, you have to have the talent in mind when you're considering the show that you are going to do for the best effect. At one time, I would have said, no, you don't do it this way. But in retrospect now, I think, yes, you do have to make considerations of this sort, especially in classic theater.
We have about a minute, Dixana. How would you answer that question? Is there something you would like to see Civic do?
I don't know if Civic has done much of Shaw, and Shaw is a favorite of mine. I'd like to see once in a while them do what would be a stretch.
I think we don't stretch
maybe not.
enough.
That's right. I know it's got terribly commercial. Once in a while, I'd like a little different. A Shaw, maybe a Chekhov.
Well, you may be right. Next year we have scheduled 4 musicals and 2 straight plays. So I think that's what you mean by commercial. Catering to the public taste. And I think all of us would probably agree that these things come slowly, but maybe it's our turn, and maybe one year in the future. Well, let me take a minute here to sign off. This is Community Theater in Middletown. Ed Strother talking with Chuck and Dixana Van Camp on August 19th, 1985. The weather is very nice tonight. Cool, I would say, about 70 degrees.